The first thing Clara felt when she got out of the car in front of the Albuquerque mansion was butterflies in her stomach that didn't come from the wind, but from anxiety. The iron gate opened slowly, revealing an impeccably manicured garden, and a house so large it looked like something out of a movie. The marble steps gleamed in the morning sun, and everything around exuded luxury, perfection, and a silent coldness. Clara adjusted the strap of her worn backpack on her shoulders, took a deep breath and moved on. This was his chance, perhaps the only one. After 5 years of being pushed from shelter to shelter, from temporary homes that never lasted, from promises of adoption that turned into silence, she now had something, a steady job, a role, a hope. She had been recommended by a social worker who, touched by the girl's sweetness, indicated her name for a vacancy as a caregiver for a child. Little Isadora, daughter of Tycoon Heitor Albuquerque, needed someone to accompany her during the day. Clara, with her calm manner and natural patience, seemed perfect for the role, at least on paper. In fact, on the very first day, the feeling of belonging evaporated before she even crossed the main door. The housekeeper, Mrs. Marta, received her without smiles. The woman's cold eyes analyzed Clara as if she were a used object being mistakenly delivered to a luxury window. She pointed to the girl's feet, who was wearing clean but worn sneakers, and commented with disdain disguised as a formality, "I hope you know what you're doing here. This is not a shelter." And, turning his back, he made it clear that she was not welcome. In the following days, the hostility of the house only increased. Clara was not included in the conversations. The employees barely looked at her. At meals, she ate alone in the pantry, and when she tried to interact, the silence or the judgmental looks answered for everyone. But nothing hurt as much as being ignored by the very family that hired her. Mr. Hector did not even speak directly to her. Always busy, always surrounded by calls and meetings, he limited himself to short nods and instructions given by third parties. For him, Clara was just a shadow, a name on paper, not even a thank you for having accepted the position. The days passed. She discovered that Isadora was a shy, fragile child surrounded by strict care. The girl suffered from severe allergies and recurrent respiratory crises. She lived surrounded by adults, but alone in her porcelain bubble. Clara, despite her insecurity, gradually approached. At first, Isadora seemed skittish, accustomed to the indifference and coldness around her. But over time, the girl let her guard down, giving in to small smiles, accepting improvised games and even extending her arms when she wanted company. It was in this silent bond that Clara began to find some solace. Even though she was invisible, to the adults in the house, she was beginning to be seen by the purest eyes there. But that didn't mean the road was easy. Mrs. Marta remained relentless. He corrected Clara's every little gesture, criticized her posture, teased the way she combed Isadora's hair or arranged her toys. He called her the girl without a past, always in a low voice, but loud enough to hurt. The rest of the mansion team was no different. Some laughed behind their backs, others just avoided contact. In her cramped rooms upstairs, Clara cried softly without anyone noticing. But each morning she came down with a clean face, a smile in place, and an unwavering will to do her best. She started to memorize the times of the medicines, the forbidden foods, the sounds that scared the girl, the songs that calmed her down. He took care of Isadora as someone who takes care of a rare flower, with delicacy and attention to every detail. It was not out of obligation. It was because, deep down, Clara knew exactly what it was like to grow up without a lap, without presence, without a hug. And she refused to let that girl feel the same. During an especially difficult afternoon, in which Mrs. Marta unjustly accused her of having let the girl fall when, in fact, Isadora had only tripped over her own feet, Clara realized that injustice was something she would have to live with for a while. No one would defend her. No one would listen to her. Even so, she didn't think about giving up. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was where she was supposed to be, even if no one agreed with it. The weeks passed, and Clara became a constant presence in Isadora's daily life. She was the one who told stories before sleep, who drew pictures to distract her on days of fever, who sang softly when the girl's breathing became irregular. Clara became more than a caregiver. It has become necessary. But ironically, she was still treated as expendable by everyone else. Invisible, as always. As much as his work was exemplary, nothing changed. The criticism continued. The gazes continued. Mrs. Marta's sharp words continued. Sometimes the housekeeper made a point of reminding everyone that Clara had no one in the world. No family, no surname, no history. Don't be fooled, he said, in front of other employees. And even when Isadora asked for Clara at important moments, it was as if the child's request was a whim, and not a choice based on affection. But Clara did not defend herself. Instead, he observed, learned, endured. In silence, he built his own space in the girl's heart. That was where it really existed, and somehow that gave him strength. In the midst of the coldness of a house where everything seemed impeccable on the outside and empty on the inside, Clara was a small flame of life, warmth and truth. Then, one rainy morning, word came that the family would be taking a trip to the country house on the outskirts of town. Isadora would go, and Clara, of course, too. Mrs. Marta, as always, would supervise everything. And as always, Clara would only be a presence on the margins, tolerated because she was useful. But there was something about that weekend that Clara didn't know yet. Something that would completely change everything. She was about to face the most difficult and at the same time most decisive moment of her life. A moment in which everything she lived, everything she learned and everything she felt for Isadora would be put to the test, because sometimes it's at the most unexpected time that someone's value finally comes out. And on this trip, Clara would discover that even the invisible can become indispensable. If you are feeling the emotion of this story as much as we felt when writing, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Clara's journey is just beginning. Clara repeats the same route every morning, with silent steps and a firm look that tries to hide her fatigue. When she arrives at the Albuquerque mansion, it is as if she were putting on a mask, the discreet smile on her face, the attentive posture, the attempt to appear invisible to the eyes of those who prefer to ignore her. However, no matter how hard she tries, there is always something wrong for Miss Marta. A glass out of place, a minimal fold in the sheet, a badly positioned cutlery, small details that serve as a pretext for sharp criticism, always said in a tone of superiority, almost as if Clara was guilty of existing. In the hallway, the other employees avoid her. Some look away, others respond with monosyllables when she tries to strike up a conversation. They have already understood that getting close to Clara means being frowned upon by Mrs. Marta, and no one is willing to risk their own job. The mansion is large, full of expensive objects and unwritten rules, but the atmosphere inside is suffocating, full of uncomfortable silences and forced smiles. For Clara, each day begins with a silent battle, maintaining dignity while being treated as if she were part of the furniture. Even so, she does not allow herself to be discouraged. When he goes up the stairs to find Isadora, his heart calms down. The 6-year-old girl runs up to her with open arms, and in that tight embrace, it all seems worth it. Isadora has a sparkle in her eyes that doesn't judge, that doesn't demand perfection. She doesn't call Clara maid, but Clara, as if she were someone in the family, as if she saw something that no one else sees. The two create a routine of their own, made up of small games, invented stories, whispered songs before nap time. Clara knows she needs to keep a respectful distance, but inside her affection for Isadora grows every day. There is a delicacy in the way the girl holds her hand, how she trusts her even on the days when she is sick or tantrum. In these moments, Clara forgets the weight of humiliations. Isadora does not know about the crossed looks, the cutting words, the sleepless nights that Clara spends studying after an exhausting shift. But he feels, somehow, that Clara is always there, whole, present, with a patience that never seems to end. The pain of rejection, however, is accumulating. As much as I try to ignore it, it is there. In the muffled whispers when Clara enters the kitchen, in the harsh notes left by the mistress, in the cold orders that treat her as if she had no soul. Clara swallows everything in silence, as if each offense were another brick on her shoulders. But she doesn't give up. She remembers her mother frequently, especially in the most difficult times. The image of her emerges clear, even with time. Trying to erase, sitting in the worn armchair in the living room, holding her daughter's hands firmly, looking into her eyes as if transferring an ancient and powerful secret. "Daughter, even when the world is cruel, choose to be light." These words echo within Clara like a constant whisper, reminding her that her strength lies not in the recognition of others, but in the daily choice not to harden herself. It is this memory that prevents her from responding when Mrs. Marta screams, that makes her get up earlier to prepare coffee the way Isadora likes, that leads her to study at night, even with her eyes burning with sleep. Because deep down, Clara believes that pain cannot be greater than hope, and that resisting with tenderness is an act of courage. Time passes slowly inside the mansion, as if the days drag on under the weight of the rigid routine, but Clara observes the small signs. The way Isadora refuses to be dressed by other employees, the smile he gives when he sees Clara coming, the way he runs to her when he's afraid of thunder, or when he scrapes his knee in the garden. There is a connection between the two that needs no words. Clara has never heard a sincere thank you from Ms. Marta or Mr. Albuquerque, but Isadora's love is a silent gift, a form of recognition that needs no ceremony. Even so, there are times when everything weighs. When he gets home at night, his body throbs, the legs hurt, the head looks like it's about to explode. Still, Clara sits at the small kitchen table, opens her notebooks and studies. The words dance on the page, but she insists. Each memorized phrase, each concept learned, is a small rebellion against the fate that they tried to impose on him. She knows she wasn't created to hide behind closed doors or be treated as invisible. There is something inside her that burns, a desire to go further, to prove, not to others but to herself, that she can do more. Meanwhile, the relationship with Isadora is strengthened. In the rare moments of rest, Clara watches her sleep, with her calm face and small hands holding one of the drawings they made together. There, in that silence, it is as if the world stopped for an instant. Clara feels a love that transcends obligations. It is not just affection from those who care, but a kind of invisible pact, as if to say, "You are not alone." And somehow, she feels that the girl also protects her in her own way. But the mansion remains relentless. There are always new demands, new tests of patience. Ms. Marta seems to strive to find fault where there are none. A towel changed out of hours, a window opened without authorization. Any slip becomes a reason for severe reprimands, almost always in front of others. Clara lowers her head, takes a deep breath and continues. Because he learned that sometimes surviving requires more strength than fighting, and because it has a purpose that goes beyond that job, to pave the way for a different future where you no longer have to hide. Sometimes, when she is alone, Clara allows herself to dream. Imagine a place where she is seen, where she can study without having to dribble her fatigue, where she can take care of herself without being treated as a subordinate. But soon, he returns to the present, to the reality that demands urgency. There is no time for long daydreams. It needs to stand firm, it needs to continue, because he knows that there is something transforming even if no one else notices. A subtle change, like a thread of light passing through a crack in the window. And that light, however small, is enough to keep it standing. On any given day, Clara finds one of Isadora's drawings lying on the floor of the room. When he picks it up, he sees that the girl has drawn two figures holding hands, a smiling child and a woman with her hair tied up and an apron. In the corner of the page, it is written in crooked letters, "Me and Clara." Her heart tightens. It's not just a children's cartoon. It is a recognition, a proof that, despite the silent contempt of the entire house, someone really sees her. It is with this image in mind that Clara faces another day. Because even when everything around her seems to deny her existence, she knows that there is a real bond, something that no humiliation can erase. And it is at this point, in this invisible but unbreakable bond, that life begins to trace new paths, still silent, still hidden, but which carry the potential to change everything. Isadora had big and curious eyes, those that seemed to look for beauty even in the smallest details of the world. From the first day Clara took care of her, it was as if the universe had created a silent bond between the two, something that needed no explanation. Isadora was fragile, but at the same time she carried impressive strength. Her asthma prevented her from running freely, from exploring the garden on days when pollen took to the air, from tasting certain foods that she saw others eating with gusto. But next to Clara, that girl began to find a new way of being a child. Clara studied medical guidelines with almost religious dedication. Each food was carefully analyzed, each space sanitized with zeal, and each toy was strategically designed so as not to provoke any reaction. But more than following protocols, she created moments. He transformed inhalation into a make-believe ritual where Isadora was a magical princess receiving her breath of power. At mealtimes, he made up stories to give life to the allowed vegetables, as if they were colorful warriors fighting to keep their bodies strong. Bedtime has become a spectacle in itself, with low songs, soft lights, and silent promises of protection. Isadora, previously restless and waking up several times during the night, now rested more peacefully, lulled by a caress that crossed any barrier. The transformation was visible. Asthma attacks have subsided, scares have become rare, and the smile? That smile became a constant presence. Isadora started to have a twinkle in her eyes and even resumed the habit of drawing, filling sheets and more sheets with scenes of girls with long braids taking care of sick little fairies, with details that only someone who lives the sweetness of care could imagine. Clara kept each of these drawings as if they were treasures, because in them was the confirmation of the bond that grew day by day. But, interestingly, all of this seemed invisible to others. Isadora's parents were grateful, yes, but they always directed the merits to the new medications, the follow-up of the pulmonologist, the food plan prepared by the nutritionist. Clara listened to everything with the same serene smile as always, but deep down she carried that silent twinge, that absence of recognition that only those who live behind the scenes of the lives of others can understand. The family saw results, but did not see the heart behind each achievement. Still, she remained firm, because something inside her had changed. In Isadora, Clara had discovered a kind of love she had never experienced before. It was not a love built out of obligation, nor by blood ties. It was a spontaneous, real, pure affection, born of constant care, of the attentive gaze, of the simple act of being present. It was as if, by taking care of the girl, she was, little by little, rebuilding something inside herself that had never been whole. There were times when Isadora looked for Clara's hand just to feel safe, small gestures, almost imperceptible, but which had an immense weight for those who knew how to recognize the value of genuine affection. And Clara recognized it. Every unexpected hug, every scribbled note, every laugh split in the middle of an impromptu romp served as silent reminders that, even if the world didn't notice, she was making a difference. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. She had never been a priority for anyone. Throughout her life, she had always learned to mold herself to what others needed, to fit into the spaces that were given to her, not to bother. But with Isadora it was different. The girl sought her presence spontaneously, wanted her company even when it was not necessary, trusted her in a way that is only possible when love is true. This bond, built with patience, empathy, and presence, grew stronger every day. And even without words, even without external recognition, Clara knew she was living something rare, something precious, something that perhaps she had never imagined could exist. It was there, in that silence full of meaning, that the purest type of connection was formed, the one that is born when two souls meet, even in such different worlds. But while Clara's heart found a home in that mutual affection, the days went on with their discreet routines, with their meticulous responsibilities, with the constant effort to keep everything in balance. And although this love that grew between them was her greatest strength, there was still a lot ahead of her, because sometimes even the deepest connections are put to the test, and what Clara still didn't know was that the next few days would bring something unexpected. Mr. Hector's cottage was surrounded by gentle hills and centuries-old trees, a refuge that offered silence and distance from the frenetic pace of the city. The weekend trip was decided almost at the last minute, It was something common in families, like Hector's, where commitments were molded to the will of the patriarch. With the agenda organized, cars ready, and employees assigned, all that remained was to ensure that Isadora was accompanied. And as always, it was up to Clara to take on this role. There were no explicit requests or orders, just that quiet expectation already known to all. She would. During the journey, the atmosphere in the car was light. Isadora seemed enchanted by the landscape that changed at every turn, pointing out sheep, clouds, and wildflowers. Clear, discreet, she kept her eyes attentive and her mind occupied. With the details that no one else noticed, the times of the medications, the safe snacks for the girl, the air temperature, the objects around. When they arrived at the house, they were greeted by a team that was already working on preparing. The environment, the imposing and ancient building with its generous balcony and high windows, breathed tradition and grandeur. Isadora was dazzled by every corner, and Clara followed her calmly, respecting the little charms of the girl, but without neglecting her safety for a second. In the first moments, everything seemed under control. Clara guided the kitchen about Isadora's dietary restrictions, reviewed the ingredients, delivered the special food she had taken, and observed the movement with double attention. It was her protocol, and she followed it precisely. However, late that afternoon, a silent change completely altered the scenery. Mrs. Marta began to exhibit unexpected symptoms: a sudden fever, severe chills, and growing malaise. The decision to return to the city was quick. Hector insisted that his mother receive immediate care, and a car was prepared to take her back, accompanied by one of the maids. Marta's absence was felt, but the routine continued. Clara, now completely responsible for Isadora, remained firm, despite the invisible weight of responsibility. The following hours were quiet at first glance. The girl played in the garden, explored. Stones and flowers jumped among the shadows of the trees, as if she had forgotten that the world offered risks. Clara was always around, alternating between vigilance and care. In the kitchen, the employees were busy preparing a collective snack. Clara, as usual, separated the safe items for Isadora and personally delivered them to those responsible. He reinforced the care, repeated the instructions, observed the dishes being assembled. Even so, something escaped. The distraction was subtle, almost imperceptible. A tray of decorated dumplings was left on the low table in the garden, within reach of the children. The aroma was sweet and the appearance inviting. Clara, for a moment, averted her eyes to fetch a glass of water. When she returned, Isadora had already taken her first bite. The effect was immediate. The girl stopped talking. The previously agitated body remained motionless. Her eyes widened with a strange glow, and her little hand went up to her neck, as if something there squeezed her inside. Clara understood at once. He ran to her. Isadora's face began to change color. Her lips lost their rosy hue, and the air simply did not come. The breath became a forced hoarse sound, as if each attempt to inhale was barred by an invisible wall. Time suddenly lost its logic. Clara felt the world close around that small body that struggled in silence. The other people around didn't know what to do. Some froze, others screamed directionlessly. But for Clara there was only one thing: Isadora. She bent down, held the girl's body firmly, and tried to talk to her, trying to stay calm, even with despair eating away at every cell in her body. There was no doubt about it. It was a severe allergic reaction. Clara knew the signs. He also knew the risks. She felt Isadora's fragility as if it were her own skin. She looked at that little face that was now fighting for oxygen, and everything inside her screamed for urgency. But the place was isolated. No hospitals nearby, no ambulances around. Without Mrs. Marta, and without Mr. Hayter, who had gone for a walk on the outskirts of the property, the girl in his arms was already beginning to give way. The flabby body, the eyes half closed, the breathing getting weaker and weaker. The panic around her was deafening, but for Clara there was only one way, one possibility, and she needed to act fast. The air seemed denser, as if every second was being swept away by the weight of panic. The silence that had preceded Isadora's collapse had been swallowed up by a whirlwind of voices, hurried footsteps, and trembling movements. But in the center of that whirlwind, Clara was only the focus. Even with her heart racing and her hands cold, she stood firm. There was no room for hesitation. She knelt next to Isadora, who lay motionless on the floor of the balcony. The girl's face was pale, her lips purplish. Her body began to writhe in gentle spasms, as if she were trying to fight something invisible. Clara felt the cold sweat running down her back, but her mind moved forward by instinct. In that moment, everything she had learned during first aid training at the shelter where she grew up began to fall into place like pieces of a puzzle she never thought she would really need to put together. Wasting no time, she opened the small purse she had always carried with her, an almost unconscious but now vital habit. Inside, the case with Isadora's emergency items, reviewed with obsessive regularity since she had learned of the seriousness of the girl's allergies. In a few seconds, Clara located the rescue medicine. He knew exactly what to do. He took a deep breath, controlling the internal tremor, and administered the dose with the precision of someone who knows that there is no margin for error. Meanwhile, he tried to keep the girl conscious. I talked to her, even without waiting for answers. He touched his face gently, observed the vital signs, controlled the position of the body so that breathing was not even more difficult. The feeling was of being on a silent battlefield, where time seemed to slip like fine sand between my fingers. Every second mattered, every detail could be decisive. Isadora was between lucidity and fainting. Clara felt it. There was a moment when everything could turn around, and nothing else would help. But there was also that other one, in which a simple gesture could reconnect life to the body. She bet everything on this second, and he fought with all his might to keep it open. The next few minutes were a compressed eternity. The air around her seemed thicker, as if everyone around was holding their breath along with her. People stopped running, watched in silence, helpless. No one else moved, only Clara, kneeling, persistent, determined. It was then that she noticed a slight change in the sound of Isadora's breathing, still weak, but more rhythmic. A contraction. In the chest, a small sigh. And then another. The girl's chest moved more consistently. The color was timidly beginning to return to the cheeks. It was not a miracle. It was technical. It was courage. It was preparation. Clara felt the knot in her stomach loosen slightly, but she didn't give in to the relief. Not yet. He continued to monitor everything with the eyes of a sentinel. The signs were there, but fragile, unstable, and she knew that. It only took one carelessness to make everything worse again. He kept the girl in a safe position, her head slightly elevated, the environment as calm as possible. He protected Isadora with his own body, like a shield. The sound of the ambulance in the distance came as a promise of reinforcement. The sirens cut through the tense silence with violence, announcing that professional help was seconds away. Clara kept her focus until the last moment. When the paramedics arrived, she relayed all the information accurately. What happened, the estimated time, what was done. No gap, no doubt. She was not only prepared, she had saved a life. The doctor bent down next to Isadora and made the initial assessment, listening carefully to Clara's every word. When he finished the first exams, he looked at her seriously, but with a discreet admiration in his eyes. He said, firmly, that if Clara had not acted with that speed, Isadora would not have survived. Words that did not come with exaggeration, but with the real weight of those who understand what almost happened. Clara remained motionless for a few seconds. Professional recognition was important, but what really affected her was something else. What might have happened if she had hesitated? If he hadn't insisted in the previous days on reviewing the emergency kit? If she hadn't paid attention to the signs that Isadora began to give before she collapsed? The what if echoed deeply. But the worst had been avoided. The paramedics prepared the stretcher, wrapped Isadora carefully, adjusted the monitors, communicated the patient's condition via radio. Clara remained by her side, attentive to every detail. He entered the ambulance as a companion, his hands still trembling and his head full of images that seemed to repeat in slow motion. It had all happened so fast, and at the same time it seemed to have lasted a lifetime. Inside the ambulance, Clara did not take her eyes off Isadora. He watched every change in his face, every subtle movement. He knew that the most serious thing had passed, but he also understood that the girl's body was still recovering from the shock. The journey to the hospital was silent, interrupted only by the technical instructions of the medical team. No one asked who Clara was. The authority with which she had assumed the situation made it clear that for Isadora, she was more than just an employee. Upon arriving, Clara quickly descended, helping to push the stretcher to the emergency ward. He provided more information to the hospital's medical staff, signed the necessary forms, accompanied the girl to the bed where she would be monitored for the next few hours. When she was finally allowed to sit alone in the cold-lit hallway, fatigue came like an avalanche, but she didn't sleep. He didn't even rest. His eyes remained fixed on the door of the room. The image of Isadora without air was still too vivid in his mind to allow any respite. Even safe, even stable, the girl still occupied all her thoughts. Clara couldn't switch off, and somehow I felt that this was just the first step of something bigger, which was yet to come. Back in the city, the routine seemed to want to resume its own rhythm, as if the hands of the clock were trying to ignore what had happened hours before. However, for some people, the weather was far from normal. Mr. Hayter, accustomed to having absolute control over everything around him, business, employees, family decisions, was interrupted by a phone call that, in an instant, disorganized everything he believed to be immutable. Initially, he listened with skepticism. The call came from one of the doctors at the private children's hospital, where Isadora had been admitted. The girl was under observation, and the condition, although still delicate, was stable. But the detail that interrupted the businessman's breathing for a few seconds came soon after. The person responsible for keeping his daughter alive until the ambulance arrived had been Clara. That Clara, the same young woman to whom he barely looked the few times they crossed paths in the corridors of the house. The orphan with a discreet expression, always a soft voice, and who for him was just one of many employees who went unnoticed in the shadow of the mansion. He wanted to question, of course. He said there must be some mistake, a coincidence perhaps. Did that girl save my daughter? Impossible. But the facts were overcoming the doubts. The hospital record had detailed notes from the emergency team. The first aid procedure had been carried out in an exemplary manner. The use of rescue medication in the exact dose, the control of the position of the body, monitoring of vital signs, clear communication with paramedics, stability was maintained until hospitalization. None of this could have been done by someone unprepared. Knowledge was needed, coolness was needed, it took courage, and Clara had demonstrated all this. Not knowing exactly how to react, Mr. Hayter went to the hospital, not out of obligation, but because of something that he himself could not yet name. Perhaps distrust, perhaps wounded pride, perhaps a remnant of humanity that resisted quietly in some corner of the chest. He arrived wearing his usual dark suit, his steps firm on the tiled floor, as if he were entering an important meeting. But the impact was immediate as soon as he crossed the door of the room. Isadora was awake, although visibly weakened, his face pale, his voice almost inaudible. Even so, her eyes lit up when they saw Clara sitting next to the bed, holding her hand gently. The girl refused to let go of the fingers of the one who, for her, was now synonymous with safety. There was something new in the child's eyes, an absolute trust and affection built not by words but by presence, by deeds. Clara didn't move when she saw her boss enter. There was no rush to justify himself, nor formal gestures of respect. He just remained where he was, as if he knew he should no longer hide behind invisible roles of subservience. And that's when something began to deconstruct itself within the man. He who has always been driven by logic, by results, by numbers. He could not measure with any of these tools what was in front of his eyes. For the first time, he saw Clara without the filters of social prejudice. He no longer saw an orphaned, silent and faded girl in the corners of the house. In front of him stood a firm, lucid young woman, endowed with a practical intelligence and a serene strength that completely disarmed him. A type of greatness that he, in all his trajectory of achievements, had never learned to identify. and even less to value. There was an uncomfortable silence in the room. A silence that was not born of the lack of subject, but of the overwhelming presence of everything that was never said. Isadora's gaze turned to her father for a moment, as if she expected something more than a physical presence from him, but he still didn't know how to fill that space. He was not used to recognizing failures, much less to deal with gratitude when it came from places he ignored out of habit. Even without words, the environment seemed to speak for itself. Clara's gestures, the serenity with which she took care of Isadora, the way she read the girl's signs and acted with delicacy and firmness at the same time, all that was eloquent. It was impossible to pretend that nothing had changed, because it had changed, and a lot. Not only in the dynamics between the two of them, but in the way Mr. Heiress himself began to perceive the world around him. The shield of his authority now seemed too thin in the face of his daughter's fragility, and of the quiet strength of that girl that he had never really noticed. The doctors returned to the room at intervals, monitoring the clinical condition carefully. Isadora still needed care, but the worst was over. Even so, she refused to sleep, if Clara was not around. The bond formed in the midst of chaos was now strengthened in the silence of the post-crisis. The girl found in Clara the kind of comfort that no toy, nurse, or distant relative could offer. Mr. Heiress watched everything with a mixture of confusion and humility. For the first time, he was not the one who brought the solution, and that left him vulnerable in a way he had never experienced. For the next few hours he stood by in silence, as if he hoped that just by observing he could understand how something so simple and yet so grandiose had happened right before his eyes. He felt small in the face of the greatness of the scene he witnessed, not because of the seriousness of the accident itself, but because of the clarity with which life, unexpectedly, had put all the pieces in their proper places. The man who had built empires and sealed millionaire contracts now found himself dismantled by something that no spreadsheet could measure. The quiet courage of a young woman he never valued, and the delivery of a child who just wanted to be close to those who really took care of her. In the corridors of the hospital, the nurses quietly commented on what they had witnessed. It wasn't just about the impressive rescue, it was about the connection between Clara and Isadora. Something genuine, rare, almost instinctive, the kind of thing that is not taught, that cannot be bought, that is not simulated. Clara had become an essential presence for the girl, not by imposition, but by merit. And that in itself said a lot. At the end of the afternoon, with calmer movement in the hospital, Clara remained close without invading spaces, but always attentive. His gaze did not seek approval, nor did he allow himself to be deceived by compliments. She had not done it expecting recognition. He had acted out of instinct, out of love, out of a sense of responsibility, all mixed together in a natural way. But even without wanting the spotlight, it was impossible to ignore the change in the air. There was something different in the expressions of everyone around, as if they had woken up to a truth that had always been there, but that was only now becoming visible. Deep down, Mr. Heiress understood that this new perception about Clara did not only say something about her. He said above all about himself, about how much he had limited himself to seeing only what interested him, what was convenient, what fit into his world of certainties. And when he realized this, he felt disconcerted, because Clara, with her firm and discreet presence, challenged all the truths he had held until then. He didn't say anything that day. I didn't know how, nor when. It just stayed, watching, trying, perhaps for the first time, to really see that young woman, with eyes stripped of prejudice, with the silent recognition of those who understand that they have a lot to learn from those who have never had a voice. And it was there, in this delicate interval between crisis and recovery, between the rigid past and the unpredictable present, that real change began to happen, not only in Isadora's feelings or in Clara's posture, but in the very heart of the man who was now faced with a choice, to continue as he always was, or to allow himself to see the world with different eyes. It was still too early for definitive answers, but something was already clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The news of Isadora's discharge comes as a breath of relief to that house where the air, for days, was suspended by anguish. The girl returns still pale, fragile, but alive, and with a new light in her eyes, something different that only Clara seemed to understand. And it was precisely Clara who she wanted around. It was not the private nurse nor the teacher hired to accompany her during her recovery. It was Clara, the girl with simple hands, soft speech, and eyes that knew how to hear what others did not say. And as much as that caused discomfort in some and astonishment in others, no one dared to contest Isadora's will. Mr. Hayter, even though he is a man used to giving orders, finds himself strange in the face of that reality. It was the first time in many years that he didn't know exactly what to do. He was used to dealing with numbers, business decisions, growth strategies. But what was done in the face of a gratitude that could not fit into words? What was said to a girl who was given so little, but who repaid with everything? It was then that, unexpectedly, Clara was called to the office. The same place where she had so often seen doors closing. This time it opened for her in a different way. There were no screams, there were no dry orders. For the first time, there was silence. A silence that carried weight, but also respect. Mr. Hector, who always spoke standing behind the desk, did something unprecedented. He stood up, pointed to the chair in front of him, and waited for Clara to sit down. She hesitated for a second, not knowing if she could really accept that gesture. But he insisted with his look. He was serious but not harsh. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her heart racing. And then his eyes met hers. It didn't take many minutes. All it took was a thank you said without arrogance, but with a weight that only those who have already lost control of something essential could understand. It was a dry thanks, almost whispered, but one that crossed Clara like a silent embrace. And in that instant, something changed. An invisible wall was torn down, and not only by him. The change was visible from that day on. Clara, who had previously walked with short and careful steps so as not to attract attention, was now noticed in every corner of the house. Mrs. Martyr, who had so often corrected her with contempt, was called in for a private conversation. There was no screaming there either, but it was clear that his behavior would no longer go unpunished. The other employees noticed the movement, and without anyone saying it out loud, understood that Clara was no longer the ignored girl. He was now a name mentioned with respect in the hallways and even at dinner. Yes, at dinner. Clara began to participate in meals with her family. At first he seemed uncomfortable. He looked at the plate carefully, kept his shoulders retracted. But soon Isadora's smiles, and even Donna Beatrice's milder comments helped her relax. The kitchen that once seemed like a place of orders was now a space for praise. The desserts she made with affection, previously consumed in silence, began to be praised in front of everyone. And it wasn't just for the taste, it was for the gesture, for his dedication. Over time, his days off began to be respected. The tasks were redistributed, and her name no longer appeared in the notes as the first to be called to solve everything. He even received a new badge, simple, but with his name highlighted and without typos. It was a small symbol, but loaded with meaning. For the first time, it seemed that someone cared to acknowledge his existence in the right way, and yet Clara remained the same. There was no ostentation, nor a change in tone. He continued to wake up early, doing his tasks with care, taking care of the plants as if each leaf had feeling. It was common to see her next to Isadora, reading books or just listening. He didn't ask for anything, he didn't demand. And perhaps that is why his presence became even more powerful. It was as if, finally, everyone realized that there was something in her that had never been for sale, dignity. But what was really surprising was the way Clara dealt with the sudden attention. Some in her place could take advantage, charge, remember daily what they had done. But Clara didn't care. He accepted the recognition with kindness, almost as if thanking for a favor he did not expect. It was as if all that, the smiles, the compliments, the seats at the table, were just details in front of what really mattered to her, Isadora's well-being. This posture, silent and firm, ended up moving Mr. Hector more than any speech. He watched from a distance. Sometimes she would stop in the hallway just to hear the soft laughter coming from her daughter's room, now so frequent since Clara was there. On other occasions, he would walk into the garden only to find them sitting side by side, sharing a fruit or exchanging secrets in a low voice. It was an intimacy that could not be bought, and he knew it. The whole house began to breathe differently. The screams subsided. The doors stopped slamming violently. Even the tone of the conversations changed. It seemed that something had reorganized, and even those who still resisted the idea of seeing Clara as part of the family now needed to recognize there was a strength in her that could not be explained only by what she did. It was in the way he looked, how he cared, how he remained present without invading the space of others. However, this new phase, although lighter, did not erase the past. Clara knew this. He carried the marks of what he experienced as someone who carries scars with dignity. Not as a victim, but as someone who learned to stand up even when the world seemed intent on keeping her on the ground. And perhaps that was precisely what made it all so true. She didn't need to prove anything. His mere presence was already an answer. Meanwhile, Isadora, stronger every day, insisted on keeping Clara close. He began to share secrets with her that he never told his mother. He started calling her my sister at heart when he thought no one was listening. And as much as she was just a child, there was a spontaneous wisdom there, as if her body knew that it only survived because Clara's heart was faster than fear. In that house, where a cold and hierarchical order had once reigned, there was now warmth. Small kindnesses began to sprout among the employees. A coffee left ready, a towel folded carefully, an exchange of glances without judgment. It wasn't just about Clara, it was about what her presence aroused in others, as if, by recognizing their silent strength, they were also invited to re-evaluate their own attitudes. But not everyone handles change well. Not everyone looks favorably on someone considered minor starting to gain space. Some watched with discomfort the new place that Claire occupied. They said nothing loudly, but murmured among themselves. And while most celebrated the transformation of that house, there were those who began to think about how to regain control that little by little escaped through the cracks. Clara's routine, which was previously made of silences and invisibility, was now marked by gestures of respect, words of affection, and above all, looks that finally saw her. She continued to wake up early, to prepare breakfast with the same care as always, to keep everything in order as she had done since she had arrived at that house. But there was something different in the air. Energy, the environment, people. The smiles were now accompanied by true gratitude, no longer out of social obligation. Clara, for the first time, felt like she belonged, not to the house nor to the goods of that family, but to the affection, to the recognition, to that symbolic space that is built when someone understands their own value. Mrs. Martyr, who had barely spoken to the young woman before, began to ask her how she was, to praise her in front of the other servants, and even to seek advice with a kind of humility she had never imagined she had. The other employees, previously distant or suspicious, approached. In a few days, Clara became a reference there. Many came to talk, to ask for opinions, to share anguish, as if that fragile girl in appearance was now a pillar of strength that everyone wanted to touch. Isadora, in turn, did not let go of the caregiver. The bond between them had become even stronger, almost as if a part of the girl had been reborn inside Clara. It was common to see them talking for hours, laughing quietly, exchanging confidences like old friends, even though the age difference was evident. The girl began to recover little by little, not only physically but emotionally as well. Confidence had returned to his gaze, and it had everything to do with the constant and warm presence of the one who, for so long, had only been the silent employee downstairs. The boss, Mr. Heater, also looked like another man, more attentive, more present. The attitude he had on the day of hospital discharge was not an isolated gesture. He began to ask about Clara's free time, to ensure that she had time for herself, to consult her opinion on Isadora's care, including in meetings with doctors and therapists. He now understood that there was a practical wisdom here that surpassed any degree, an intelligence of the heart that few possessed, And it was in this new scenario in which Clara's name finally gained voice and respect that the unexpected happened. A national foundation focused on valuing young caregivers became aware of Isadora's case through a newspaper article. The article highlighted Clara's decisive role in the girl's recovery, mentioning not only the help at the time of crisis, but also her silent and constant action throughout the most difficult months. The story moved readers of all ages and quickly reached the organizers of a national conference on the role of young caregivers in Brazil. The invitation came in the form of a simple letter, but full of emotion. They wanted to hear Clara. They wanted her to tell her story, her pains, her courage, and above all, her love. The one that so often manifests itself in the silence, renunciation, and resistance of those who care without expecting anything in return. At first, she hesitated. I had never spoken in public. He felt that his voice was too small to echo in full auditoriums, but all it took was a look from Isadora, a gesture of encouragement from her boss, and a firm word of support from the medical team for Clara to understand. This was not just about her. It was about all the invisible like her. It was time to break the silence for good. And so, a few days later, there was Clara, standing in front of a packed auditorium. His hands trembled at first, but his gaze fixed on a point at the back of the hall gave reassurance. When he began to speak, the first sentences came contained, almost shy. But as he told the details of his trajectory, the loss of his parents, the life of sacrifices, the whole days with Isadora, emotion was taking over the audience. People cried in silence, others clasped their hands on the arms of the chairs, as if they wanted to hold the words that crossed them inside. The most striking moment of the presentation came when Clara said, with an almost cutting firmness, that she had learned to be strong in the moments when she could not ask for help, that she had discovered the value of her own existence when she understood that loving and caring for someone was a form of resistance. She spoke with a calmness that came from the soul, without victimhood, without seeking pity. It was pure truth, a truth that overflowed. When the performance ended, the audience stood. The applause was not just out of compassion, they were out of admiration, a deep and collective admiration for someone who, until recently, was barely noticed. On the same night, the organization of the event published the full video of the speech on social networks. In less than 24 hours, the content had already been shared by thousands of people. Emotional comments came from all corners of the country, many from young caregivers who saw themselves in her, others from families who had never reflected on the weight that fell on the shoulders of those who care in silence. It was then that an international NGO, focused on supporting caregivers of people with chronic diseases, contacted Clara. They had watched the video, were deeply moved, and wanted to offer something in recognition of the work and soul of this young woman. The proposal was clear: AI, full scholarship so that she could study nursing, a complete course with psychological support allowance and the possibility of exchange. It was the future knocking on the door of those who, for so long, had lived locked behind the scenes of the lives of others. The news was greeted with tears, smiles, and sincere hugs. Mr. Heiter, visibly moved, promised to support her in everything she needed. He said that this was only the first of many doors that would open, and he wasn't exaggerating. Clara began to receive invitations for interviews, tributes in schools, and even messages from famous people who said they were inspired by her story. Suddenly, that girl with a serene look, who cleaned the corners of the house while the others dined, became a symbol of empathy, resilience, humanity. The example that was missing in a world so hurried, so noisy, and so in need of listening. But the most impressive thing was that, even with all this happening around her, Clara remained the same. He continued to wake up early, organizing the coffee with affection, taking care of Isadora with the same patience as always. He did not allow himself to be corrupted by sudden fame or the glare of the spotlight. His focus remained firm: to care, love, and continue transforming what he touched, even if in silence. Gradually, however, new possibilities began to take shape in his head. The desire to study, to broaden horizons, to use knowledge to do even more for people. Clara never dreamed of luxury. His greatest wish was, and always has been, to be able to help with more preparation, with more tools, with more safety. And, now with the scholarship in hand, this desire was no longer just a hidden thought to become a possible road, a path that she, with her determined calmness, was about to tread. Time passed like a breath, but the roots of Clara's transformation remained firm. The days of solitude and swallowed silences gave way to mornings of purpose and nights of gratitude. She walked through each phase of nursing school with a determination that many admired but few fully understood. It wasn't just about graduating. It was about honoring every silent tear, every sleepless night with Isadora, every humiliation that turned into fuel. Each class, each internship, each patient care was more than learning. It was a life mission. Clara stood out among her colleagues, not because of the highest note or the most eloquent speech, but because of the way he touched people, literally and emotionally. He had a way of looking into the eyes, of listening with his whole body, of making even the most aloof patient let his guard down. It wasn't technique, it was presence. It was raw empathy shaped by life. Teachers noticed, patients commented, supervisors indicated, but she never let the compliments go to her head. He knew where he came from, and that was enough to keep her feet on the ground, no matter how much life now seemed to invite her to fly. Isadora grew up next to her, as if time was also at the service of something greater. She was no longer the little girl who had to be carried in her arms during crises. With Clara's unconditional support, she became a confident, affectionate teenager full of plans. There was an invisible pact between them, made not of words but of shared stories, a bond that did not depend on surname but on choice. Choice to love, to care, to remain. Mr. Heiter in turn has aged differently since he decided to open his heart. Clara's constant presence brought to the mansion a kind of warmth that he no longer remembered existing. Not the warmth of luxury or routine full of appearances, but the one that comes from an unexpected laugh, from a plate of simple food shared without haste, from a memory told with a twinkle in the eye. He began to introduce her to friends, family, and even strangers as the woman who saved what I had most precious. And it was not an exaggeration. For him, Clara had returned Isadora, alive, healthy, and happy. But more than that, he had given back to himself the ability to feel. The mansion, which once seemed like a monument to distancing, has changed, not of architecture, but of soul. The once cold hallways now echoed conversations, laughter, smells of lovingly made food. The old kitchen, where Clara could barely enter, was now her favorite territory, a place of spontaneous meetings, nightly confidences, and reconstructed memories. The garden, previously just a scenery, became a space for celebration. There, birthdays were celebrated, small achievements celebrated, new memories planted. The house, which was once a symbol of rejection, has become a home. But Clara did not settle. It was not to rest in recognition or to feed only on one's own achievement. Something inside her pulsed louder, the urgency to give back. He knew that behind each invisible young man there were stories similar to his own, boys and girls who just needed a chance, not charity, but someone who saw value before victory. So she began to visit shelters, talk to educators, offer her time to mentor other young people. And little by little his presence became a reference, not because it imposed itself, but because it represented what everyone wanted to believe, that it is possible to get out of the deep end and find meaning in pain. She created a support network for young orphans, where there were not only donations but listening, mentoring, affection. She told her story not as a heroine, but as a witness that no one is too small to dream big. It showed that the past hurts, yes, but that it does not need to define the future. And so he transformed lives, one at a time, without spotlights, but with consistency. Around her, people began to see her as more than a health professional. Clara has become a symbol of overcoming, a kind of light that does not dazzle, but illuminates paths. I was invited to speak in schools, in social projects, even in universities. But everywhere he went, he made a point of reinforcing a truth that guided his journey. Someone's value is not in their surname, appearance, or place of birth. but in their ability to choose the good, even when everything around them invites them to give up. Still, behind the respect earned, Clara maintained the same humility as when she slept in silence so as not to wake Isadora. He continued to wake up early, organizing his routine carefully, keeping the house in harmony. The difference is that now, each gesture was made with the freedom of those who belong. She was no longer the stranger trying to fit in. She was part of the story, part of the family, part of the future. The years have made it even stronger, but also more sensitive. She knew that the road there had been made of wounds, and that not all of them healed in the same way. Therefore, he never judged the pain of the other. He knew how to recognize in the eyes of others what he had already felt in his own reflection. That was the secret of her connection with people. She didn't speak from above, she spoke from within. Clara also began to write. No books yet, but diaries, letters, loose notes that he kept in a small wooden box, a gift from Isadora. In them he told experiences, reflections, small miracles of everyday life. It was his way of keeping alive the memory of what he built, and perhaps one day sharing with anyone who needed to hear that it is worth resisting. Even with her busy schedule and commitments piling up, she always found time for Isadora. Walks in the park, conversations on the balcony, new recipes tested together. It was as if the outside world could not interrupt what, for Clara, was sacred, the bond between them. And every time he looked at his sister, he saw not only the result of his efforts, but also the vivid memory of why he began to fight. In the community where she grew up, Clara was greeted with hugs, emotional looks, and words she never thought she would hear. Those who had previously barely noticed her existence now admired her, not because she had won in life, but because she refused to let life win over her hope. He used each visit to inspire young people, listen to mothers, strengthen families. The past still lived there, but now it was seen with pride, not as a mark of pain, but as a proof of strength. And even with so many commitments, Clara remained firm in her silent purpose, to ensure that no invisible child went through the pain of feeling worthless. Therefore, his every gesture had intention. Each conversation a purpose, every hug a message, you matter. And that was enough to change lives. She knew that, because one day that's exactly what she had to hear to start over. Between one meeting and another, between a shift and a lecture, she maintained the simple routine that she loved so much. He grew flowers in the backyard, prepared coffee the way Isadora liked it, wrote at night while listening to the low music coming from the next room. The mansion now smelled of home, and his life, once marked by rejections, was now a firm seam of meaning, affection, and mission. As much as the rush was intense, there was a peace in Clara's eyes that no one could take away. A serenity of someone who has made peace with the past and chosen to write the future with his own hands. But even with all she had accomplished, a new opportunity was about to arise, something that would unite everything she had experienced, all she had learned, and all she still wanted to transform. It was the kind of invitation that is not expected, but that, when it arrives, seems tailor-made for those who lived each chapter with truth. This trajectory shows in a simple and powerful way that someone's true value is never where they start, but in everything they choose to do. Clara was rejected, humiliated, and ignored, but she found in empathy and courage the tools to change her story and gain respect and love. How many other Claras will be out there just waiting for a chance to reveal all their strength? If this story resonated there, leave your like. It's a way of saying that the connection made sense. And if you've stayed this far, comment, "I'm with you until the end," so we know that this message has reached where it was needed. The channel is here to walk together, bringing stories and content that inspire and strengthen. Take a look at that video on the side which tells a similar story. Click and stay with me there, because every walk is better with company.